Have you ever been caught off guard in a conversation, not knowing what to say? You walk away replaying the whole thing in your head thinking, I should have said this. Today, I want to share 5 smart responses inspired by Jordan Peterson's way of thinking. These aren't cheap comebacks or insults. They're calm, intelligent replies that can completely shift a conversation, sometimes even silence someone without raising your voice. Let's break them down, one by one. Response 1. What do you mean by that? This sounds so simple, right? But it's one of the most powerful replies you can ever use. When someone throws an accusation, a vague insult, or sweeping statement at you, don't jump into defense mode. Instead, just ask, what do you mean by that? It does 2 things. It forces the other person to clarify their point. It buys you time to think. Most people throw out opinions without thinking them through. For example, someone at work says, "You're not a team player." Instead of panicking, you calmly respond, "What do you mean by that?" Now the burden is on them. They either explain themselves with facts or they stumble because they didn't really have a clear reason. This is not about being confrontational. It's about seeking clarity. Often, vague criticism loses its power when you simply shine a light on it. From a psychological perspective, this works because it shifts the pressure. People love to criticize, but they hate being asked to back up their words with evidence. It's easier to throw a stone than to explain why you threw it. Personal note. I've used this line many times. Sometimes people back down right away. Sometimes they try to explain, but even then, the tone of the conversation changes. It's no longer them attacking, you're now having a real discussion. If you like this first point, hit like and tell me in the comments, when was the last time you wished you had asked someone, "What do you mean by that?" Response 2. Let's define our terms. Another smart move is to slow down the conversation and ask for definitions. A lot of arguments are actually fights over words, not real issues. For example, someone says, "You're selfish." But what does selfish mean? Does it mean you said no to something you didn't want to do? Does it mean you're protecting your time? Or does it mean you actually harmed someone? By calmly saying, "Let's define what we mean by selfish here," you bring the discussion back to logic instead of emotion. This response is especially useful in heated debates about politics, religion, or morality. People throw around terms like justice, freedom, fairness, but those words mean different things to different people. Without a shared definition, you're not really debating, you're just talking past each other. Psychologists often talk about semantic confusion, when people argue without agreeing on the meaning of words. Clearing up definitions can end a fight before it even starts. Here's an example from everyday life. Imagine your partner says, "You never support me." Instead of reacting defensively, you say, "Okay, let's define what you mean by support here. Do you mean emotional support, financial help, or something else?" This shows maturity. It shows you're not trying to win the fight, you're trying to understand. Personal note. I've noticed that when you ask people to define their words, many actually calm down. They realize they were speaking in generalities and it makes them rethink their tone. Response 3. That's an interesting point. Can you explain why you think that way? This one is beautiful because it's polite, but it flips the situation. If someone challenges you, instead of rushing to counterattack, just say, "That's interesting. Why do you think that?" Now they're on the spotlight. They have to explain their reasoning. This works in almost any setting. In a classroom, when someone dismisses your opinion, at work, when a colleague disagrees with your plan, even at family gatherings, when an uncle throws out a bold political claim. By asking them to explain, you're not only protecting yourself, you're also showing genuine curiosity. And here's the thing, most people are not used to being asked why. They expect a fight. They expect pushback. Instead, you surprise them with a calm question. Psychologically, this taps into something called cognitive dissonance. When people have to explain themselves out loud, they sometimes realize that their argument isn't as strong as they thought. The act of speaking forces them to notice gaps in their logic. Personal note: I once used this response during a group project. Someone flat out dismissed my idea, saying it wouldn't work. Instead of defending myself, I just said, "That's interesting. Why do you think that?" They stumbled, realized they didn't actually have a reason, and the group quickly moved on. That silence spoke louder than anything I could have said. Response 4. Compared to what? This one is a classic, and it's sharper than it looks at first. People often make sweeping claims. They'll say things like, "This system is unfair. That policy is terrible. Life is just too hard." And instead of jumping in with your own argument, you calmly ask, "Compared to what?" It forces perspective. Nothing exists in isolation. Every complaint is relative to something else. Take the example of someone saying, "Capitalism is bad." Instead of agreeing or disagreeing right away, you ask, "Compared to what? What system do you think works better, and why?" Now the conversation changes. The person has to show they've thought beyond slogans. This is not about belittling anyone. It's about reminding people that all ideas exist in context. You can't criticize one thing without measuring it against another. From a psychological standpoint, this question pushes the brain into analytical thinking. It shifts the person from emotional reaction to logical comparison. It's the same reason why teachers often ask students to compare and contrast instead of just describe. It demands deeper reasoning. Everyday life example. Let's say your friend says, "This city is awful." You can calmly ask, "Compared to which city? What makes the other one better?" Suddenly, they have to provide a real example. Sometimes they can't, and the conversation falls silent. What evidence would convince you? This response is powerful when you're stuck in a debate that feels endless. Think about how arguments usually go. You bring facts. The other person ignores them or twists them. The cycle repeats and nobody moves. Instead of throwing more facts, ask, "Okay, what evidence would convince you that it works?" If they can't answer, you've uncovered the truth. They're not open to evidence at all. Philosophers call this the falsifiability test. For a belief to be rational, there must be some possible evidence that could disprove it. If no evidence is acceptable, then the belief is more like dogma than reason. Everyday life example. A friend says, "All politicians are corrupt." You could ask, "What evidence would convince you that at least one isn't?" That question alone can end the argument because it exposes the absolute nature of the claim. Personal note: I've used this response in online discussions where people seemed locked in. Sometimes they admit, "Honestly, nothing would convince me." And at that point, I know the debate is over. There's no point in pushing further. Cultural and analytical angle. These 5 responses may look simple, but they share a common thread. They turn the spotlight around. Instead of rushing to defend yourself, you calmly ask for clarity, perspective, and evidence. If you think about it, this is the exact opposite of how most of us were trained to argue. We think debates are about winning points. But in reality, the smarter move is to shift the responsibility back to the other person. Psychologically, this aligns with something called the Socratic method. Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher, rarely gave direct answers. Instead, he asked questions that revealed contradictions in his opponent's arguments. Over time, the other person often silenced themselves. Jordan Peterson's style often echoes this tradition. It's less about giving people lectures in the middle of a fight and more about calmly asking questions that make them rethink their certainty. And let's be honest, in our culture today, people speak with a lot of certainty. Social media has trained us to make bold statements without proof. These 5 responses are like antidotes to that culture. They invite reflection where there used to be noise. Pulling it all together. Let's quickly recap the 5 smart responses. What do you mean by that? Exposes vague or shallow criticism. Let's define our terms. Stops fights over words and forces clarity. That's interesting. Why do you think that? Polite, but shifts the burden of explanation. Compared to what? Brings perspective and context into the conversation. What evidence would convince you? Reveals whether the other person is open to reason at all. Notice something. None of these involved yelling, insulting, or trying to dominate. They are calm, respectful, and rooted in curiosity. That's why they're so effective. They cut through noise without aggression. Everyday applications. Now, let's ground this in real-life situations where you might use them. At work. Imagine your boss or coworker criticizes your project. Instead of panicking, you say, "What do you mean by that?" This can transform a harsh critique into a constructive discussion. With family. Family arguments often spiral because people use loaded words. Next time someone says, "You never help around the house," you might reply, "Okay, let's define what help means here." That turns conflict into clarity. On social media, online debates usually go nowhere. Instead of drowning in endless back and forth, try, "What evidence would convince you?" Often, the other person won't have an answer, and that ends the cycle. In friendships, if a friend says something dismissive, like, "Your ideas don't make sense," you can simply ask, "That's interesting. Why do you think that?" Suddenly, the tone changes from judgment to explanation. Analytical angle. Why they work. The power of these responses lies in their structure. Each one forces the conversation to slow down. In psychology, there's a concept called cognitive load. People can only juggle so much information at once. When you ask them to define terms, explain reasoning, or give evidence, you increase their cognitive load. If their argument is weak, it collapses under its own weight. On a cultural level, these responses challenge the current trend of shallow, fast communication. Social media rewards speed, but not depth. But depth is what creates silence, reflection, and even respect. Thinkers from Socrates to Carl Jung have pointed out that asking the right question is often more powerful than giving the right answer. These 5 responses prove that. My personal take. I've noticed something in my own life. When I use these responses, people often stop, pause, and think. At first, I worried it might come across as confrontational. But over time, I realized it's actually the opposite. People appreciate being asked to clarify. They may feel challenged, but they also feel respected. That's the beauty of this approach. It's not about humiliating anyone. It's about encouraging better conversations. And in a world filled with shouting matches, that's a rare skill. Final thoughts. So, the next time someone comes at you with vague criticism, strong opinions, or endless complaints, don't panic, don't fight back, and don't shut down. Instead, calmly use one of these 5 responses. You'll be surprised how quickly the tone changes. And here's my question for you. Which of these 5 responses do you think you'll try first in your own life? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you found this helpful, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss more content like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.